Welcome to episode 109 of 10 Minute Record Reviews, and today I'm going to talk about Deep Purple's 1974 album Burn, with the classic cover with the five band members immortalized in wax as candles. Well, not really immortalized because of course the candles burn and melt on the back cover. And a quick reminder to please subscribe if you like what I'm doing, it means a lot. So this is a Deep Purple album, and Deep Purple, of course, are one of the triumvirate of great classic early 1970s heavy rock bands from England. The other two, of course, being Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath. But unlike those two other bands, who each spent about a decade at the top with an unchanged lineup, Deep Purple is, of course, riven historically with ego battles and factional disputes and changing lineups. They are, of course, still touring today, but it's the era between 1968 and 1976, those 8 years which really matter in the history of the band. And in that era, there are three different lineups. The first, the so-called Mark I lineup, was founded in 1968 by keyboardist John Lord, virtuoso guitarist Ritchie Blackmore, drummer Ian Paice, bassist Nick Simper, and singer Rod Evans. This version of the band experienced only moderate success and is best known in retrospect for their single Hush. The second and most successful version of the band, the so-called Mark II lineup, forms in 1970. Simper and Evans are on the way out, and in come Ian Gillan on vocals and Roger Glover on bass. And this is the version of Deep Purple which achieves global fame over the next 2 or 3 years. The last significant lineup, or the Mark III version of the band, dates from late 1973, and this sees Ian Gillan depart, Roger Glover kicked out immediately after Gillan departs, and in come David Coverdale on vocals and Glenn Hughes, a bass player who also was able to sing backup and sometimes lead vocals. And this version of the band continues for on and off a couple of years until the band falls apart with one more lineup change after 1976. This album, Burn, is the very first album of the Mark III lineup, at this point a world-famous band who are now trying to replace their world-famous singer. It completely delivers. It's up there with any of the very best albums this band produced in any of their incarnations, and it's one of the great hard rock albums of the 1970s. After the first version of the band had found some moderate success, Ritchie Blackmore listened to Led Zeppelin's debut album and decided in 1970 that the band needed to go in a hard rock direction. The first album of the Mark II lineup, 1970's Deep Purple and Rock, was as heavy an album as anything that was out there at the time, with the possible exception of things that Black Sabbath were doing. The band hits a rich vein of form. It's followed up in 1971 by the album Fireball, and then in 1972 with probably their greatest achievement, Machine Head, which of course features their signature song Smoke in the Water. But the cracks were starting to appear. They'd been touring nonstop for several years. They were living in each other's pockets, as one does on the road, and were increasingly living inside each other's heads as personality conflicts began to emerge. Although theoretically a band of equals, in fact it was Ritchie Blackmore who had the most sway, because of course it was his advice to the band to pursue the hard rock direction which had led them to so much fame and fortune. He was also easily one of the most talented members of the band, and in an era which celebrated virtuoso hard rock guitarists, he was up there in a pantheon which included a very small number of other players. He talked to Ian Paice, the drummer, about leaving and forming a trio with Phil Lynott from Thin Lizzy. This didn't come to pass because Paice didn't want to leave the group, so Ritchie began to look inwards within Deep Purple, questioning how the band's lineup could be refreshed in a way which would allow them to chart out new directions. He and Ian Gillan had already been feuding for a variety of reasons: Ritchie's spiky personality, Gillan's boozing, and so when Gillan announced that he was leaving the band, Blackmore was more than happy to have that occur. He wanted to have, as well, a bassist who could sing harmonies. Glover had come along with Gillan in 1970, and Ritchie saw them as part of a package. It was not long after Gillan's departure that Ritchie convinces Deep Purple's management to show Glover the door as well. So the band now had to find a bassist and a vocalist, and they partly solved both problems by bringing in Glenn Hughes, the bass player for the Anglo-American band Trapeze. Hughes himself had agreed to come in because he thought they were bringing in Paul Rodgers of Free as the principal vocalist, and he was going to be essentially singing companion/backup vocals. The Rodgers thing didn't happen because he was forming Bad Company, and so the band let it be known that they were auditioning for a lead vocalist. And a little-known singer by the name of David Coverdale, who had sung for a number of unremarkable bands in the north of England, one of which was called The Government, had seen an article in the Melody Maker which said that Purple needed a vocalist. So The Government and Purple had shared a bill at one point, and so he already knew the band members. He sent them a tape, came down and auditioned, and got the gig, basically on the strength of two things. First of all, Blackmore loved his voice, which was bluesy and gravelly. The other thing which really cemented Coverdale's position in the band was that he and Hughes clicked right off the bat. The very first day of the auditions, Lord and Blackmore and Pace go out for lunch. Hughes and Coverdale hang out back at the rehearsal space, work out some vocal arrangements. After lunch, the other band members come back. They play them these arrangements and sing them, and basically Coverdale is in at that point. Everyone was so impressed. To record the album, the band went back to Montreux on the Lake Geneva shoreline, where of course they'd recorded their most famous work, Machine Head, and again they used the Rolling Stones mobile. Both Hughes and Coverdale, for the most part, had little difficulty covering the range of the songs that had been sung in the Gillan era. And this album rocks just as hard as the album from the Mark II lineup, but if anything, it swings a little bit more. All the way through the album, with the exception of one song, Hughes and Coverdale share the vocal responsibilities. Coverdale primarily takes the lead. Hughes is routinely singing harmony, choruses, but sometimes takes lead elements himself. But they're sharing duties, as I say, in all but one song, which is Mistreated. And that song was the only one which was not a new composition for this album. It was something which Blackmore had held back from the Machine Head sessions, and then Coverdale subsequently added lyrics. Side 1 famously starts with the title track, which has that absolutely epic riff. Thematically, this song is a bit of a window into Blackmore's future work with Ronnie James Dio in Rainbow, because it's about an evil magic lady. This song is full of hooks. There's lots of interesting pieces to it. There's Hughes' introduction as a singer, where he starts to sing the companion piece around the chorus, where he sings, "You know, we had no time," and so on. There is the use of a mini-moog synth at various points, and there's a slightly medieval-flavored organ solo, which has an almost harpsichord kind of touch done by Lord. Just based on the riff alone, it's one of the all-time great hard rock songs. I've never thought all the elements of this song work totally well. In particular, I find the organ solo a little bit plinky, but that's just splitting hairs. This is a monumental start for the new lineup. That's followed by the first real foray into boogie rock, which is Might Just Take Your Life. Not quite sure what this is about, and don't know that the lyrics stand a hell of a lot of scrutiny. Don't think that really matters. Just as Byrne has started with this great guitar riff, it's an organ riff from Lord which starts this song. Eventually Ritchie comes in to double on that. This is an interesting song. It's one of the very few Purple songs that doesn't actually have a Ritchie Blackmore solo. Listening to Hughes on the bridge, I can see why Blackmore wanted to make sure Coverdale was in the band with a slightly grittier sound, because I'm not sure Hughes could have carried the band by himself. The choruses are maybe a little uninspired, but Lord's solo in the outro is superb. The next song is Lay Down, Stay Down, which is a song about doing the wild thing, and this is another song where the new sound of the band really becomes apparent. I think what one has to say about this song is, although it's pretty good, it could have been a song written by any number of kind of slightly lesser boogie rock bands from the 1970s. And even when Ritchie does come into solo, I find he sounds a little bit like an adornment here as opposed to an integral part of the song, but still it's a third consecutive strong track. And the final track on side 1 is an absolute killer, Sail Away. Ian Pace's drumming is totally to the fore. This has an incredibly funky, righteous riff and groove all the way through. It's the new sound of the band, but it's very, very effective, and it shows actually how well Blackmore could actually play the funky stuff, even though it wasn't necessarily to his taste. Side 2 starts with You Fool No One. I like the song quite a lot. It sounds, strangely at points, very much like Cream's I Feel Free. Refreshingly, at this point in the album, when you're starting to wonder what's happened to the old Purple sound, there is superb interplay between Blackmore and Lord, which reminds you exactly who you're listening to, and that those talents are still integral to the whole music of the band. The only sour note in this song is that this is another entry in the threatening domestic violence file of songwriting, along with Hey Joe and Run For Your Life and so on. Yeah, it's a lyrical pose from the early 70s, but still kind of reinforces bullshit attitudes, so not cool. What's going on here is more boogie rock. It's about an all-night bender, drunk dialing exes, and getting in trouble, classic rock and roll themes. At this point, halfway through side 2, we've had an album with 6 songs which are either excellent or very, very good. The last 2 songs I'm not as sold on. The first of those, of course, is Mistreated, the song which Ritchie had held back from the Machine Head sessions. This is a showpiece for Coverdale. Again, he sings this solo. There's no Hughes on this. It's the longest song on the album, and because of that, because it's a slow blues, I think it needs some dynamics to stop it lurching into becoming a bit of a dirge. I don't know that it truly does that. I think Coverdale is still kind of finding himself. It maybe goes on 2 minutes too long. If they'd introduced some other elements, maybe it's a little more interesting than it is. That said, it's a good performance by Coverdale. The playing is generally excellent, as you'd expect. The final song, A200, is just an oddity. This is bluntly a bad prog rock song. It's a dismal cross between Emerson, Lake and Palmer and a synthy Italian porn soundtrack, but it does have a wicked Ritchie solo, even if that feels a little dropped in. The fame of Deep Purple's Mark II lineup generally means that the Coverdale-Hughes era can get overlooked. This is a shame because Coverdale in particular is excellent here, as he was through the whole Mark III period and through his early Whitesnake period as well. This is a guy really hitting a vein of form, and the quality totally shines through. You can see why Blackmore in particular jumped to the chance to include him in the band. Again, this album rocks as hard as anything they ever did, but it also has a rhythm section which, if anything, swings a little harder than before, and that's not a bad thing. In my opinion, nothing else that Deep Purple did reaches the level of Machine Head, but this album, I think, is in a solid second place, or a second place tie along with In Rock. You have to mark it down a little bit for the dismal A200, but otherwise it's 4.5 out of 5 stars.